We are less than 2 weeks away from the Iowa caucuses and 3 weeks from New Hampshire primaries, which together kick off the 2024 presidential cycle in earnest. New polling shows Nikki Haley on the rise, breaking into double digits nationally and rocketing up in New Hampshire. You can see the pink line jumping within striking distance of Donald Trump, clearly an alarming development for Trump's camp. The ex-president has taken to insulting Haley, calling her bird brain. Haley is taking shots at DeSantis, and Chris Christie is pretty much going after everybody.
Nikki Haley promised.
I will not now, not ever, support raising the gas tax.
Really? Not now? Not ever?
Ron DeSantis is lying because he's losing. DeSantis called China Florida's most important trading partner. DeSantis even allowed a Chinese military contractor to expand just miles from a U.S. naval base. Phony Ron DeSantis. Too lame to lead, too weak to win.
He caused a riot on Capitol Hill. He'll burn America to the ground to help himself. Every Republican leader says that in private. I'm the only one saying it in public. What kind of president do we want? A liar or someone who's got the guts to tell the truth? New Hampshire, it's up to you.
Brendan Buck is a Republican strategist who served as press secretary of vice presidential nominee Paul Ryan in 2012. Jennifer Horn is the former chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party. They join me now. I'll start with you, Brendan. This is what's interesting to me when I'm looking at these numbers. I see Nikki Haley improving. I see Chris Christie continuing to take shots at everybody. I see Ron DeSantis sort of fading. Is all of this just sort of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Is there any chance, not just that somebody beats Donald Trump for the nomination, do you think there's any chance that he doesn't just sweep all the primaries?
Oh, I think it's a very good bet that he's going to sweep all the primaries. I'll let Jennifer talk about New Hampshire, but it is notable that Nikki Haley is close. I mean, that is the closest we've seen anybody. Now, is that enough to win? No, but I do think that we need to remember that Nikki Haley's rise here has gone with Donald Trump largely ignoring her. And it seems that he's no longer going to be doing that. And I think we need to appreciate that Donald Trump is more than capable of knocking out Nikki Haley in the same way that he did to Ron DeSantis. I mean, Ron DeSantis was pretty close, if not ahead of Donald Trump in some polls at the beginning of this year. And his slip was two things. One, it was just he proved to be a bad candidate. But the second was Donald Trump came out pummeling Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis didn't know how to respond. So if Donald Trump turns on Nikki Haley now and really starts taking shots at her, I think he'll be able to very easily clear that, and this primary will be over very, very quickly.
Jennifer, I have to ask you, as former head of the party in New Hampshire, sometimes New Hampshire voters, they like to be contrarian. Sometimes they see what happens in Iowa and they're like, well, you know what? I want to do something different just to keep this spicy and interesting. Do you think that is a possibility? Do you think if Donald Trump just basically runs circles around everybody in Iowa, that New Hampshire Republican voters may say, hold on, we're going to put our support behind Nikki Haley or Chris Christie? Or do you think that a successful caucus for Donald Trump in Iowa will pretty much mean that everybody will get in line in New Hampshire?
I don't see that, and I would take charge, I think, with the idea of New Hampshire voters exactly being contrarian, but more independent thinking is how I used to think of us. But what I see in New Hampshire, honestly, is that Donald Trump's support has been deep and broad, both, and that it has been consistent. And while Nikki Haley has been able to sort of creep up closer and closer, remember that really happened and supported in great part by the spending, millions and millions of dollars of spending by Americans for Prosperity over the last month. And now that she is getting closer, as to the previous point, Trump has the ability to just crush her if he wants to in New Hampshire. I think, I think somebody just referenced that she was within striking distance. I don't necessarily really agree with that. I don't think she's quite there yet. If she gets down within single digits, then she's within striking distance. But I think Donald Trump has himself perfectly positioned still, in spite of her rise. I think he's going to win New Hampshire. I think he's going to continue to win after that. And then what I really think is the interesting question is going to be at what point does the RNC step in and publicly suggest that everybody else should get out of the way? I think that they will eventually come in and ask Nikki Haley to step aside.
Brendan, cynically, in previous election seasons, 2012, 2016, where there usually is somebody who's a really, really strong candidate, a lot of times political commentators, analysts will say, well, you know what, these people are just running for vice president. Given how Donald Trump treated his last vice president and his supporters threatened his last vice president, do you think there is anyone in the current Republican field who has that delusion? Is Nikki Haley thinking to herself, well, you know what, I might miss the moon, but I'll be amongst the stars. Donald Trump will pick me. I know Chris Christie couldn't have that idea. Are there any Republicans now who think that that's their opportunity, or are they still really running because they either think that Trump will stumble or maybe they'll have a chance to raise some more money?
Yeah, I think at this point, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, the two more serious people, are really just running to save face. I think Nikki Haley is hoping that she can have a strong second, and if Donald Trump loses in a general election, she is potentially still viable and kind of say, I told you so. I think Ron DeSantis is trying to salvage something of his future. I mean, the shine has completely come off of Ron DeSantis, and if he comes in third in Iowa after spending so much time there and has to basically drop out in shame, his future may be done. I think he sees himself as, if not this time, I still need to be able to run in the future. I'm sure Nikki Haley the same. So they're trying to save their future, I think, at this point more than anything.
Jennifer, very quickly, we've talked about this earlier in the show. There is just a litany of court cases that Donald Trump is going to have to face heading into primary season. Do you think that has any impact at all, that there may actually be some Super Tuesday states that he doesn't necessarily have as much time to campaign in because he's going to be in court? Will that make any difference one way or another?
I really don't think it will in the end. Donald Trump doesn't need to campaign in person the way all the other candidates do. And we've seen time after time after time that the more indictments he faces, the more legal trouble he faces, the deeper that his support grows in amongst most Republican voters. They believe that Donald Trump is a symbol for themselves and their party, that he's being attacked is somehow an attack on them. And as long as, yes, I really don't think it's going to impact the outcome of this race.